One Step Ahead by Lundquist and Beslick.
We are back and we have been broadcasting several interesting interviews, and James is with us today. James, welcome to One Step Ahead Radio.
Hello, Sasha. Hello, everybody who's joining us. Good to be here.
And I'm sorry that my voice is not the top today, but I'll try to do my best throughout the session. I mean, going into what's going on right now, it's almost like a roller coaster. There are so many things happening in the same time. I guess that's the entire idea of flooding the space with what Stephen Bannon said. Shit. And not really nice to say the word in a broadcasting session, but that's basically how it feels right now. James, there have been a lot of discussions last weeks of actually related to deregulation, Omnibus. What does it mean? What is the impact on the companies? How will the implementation of this change the level playing field for the companies? James, any views, comments on this one? I have a couple of them, but let's start with your view and your opinion about this.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I'd also invite our listeners, if you haven't already had a chance to go back. In the last few weeks, we've had some very good, very special guests on the show, who've been also giving us their read and their interpretation of where we're going in this early 2025. So I'd invite you all to have a listen. Episode 24, we spoke to Professor Ioannis Ioannou from London Business School, a very strong and engaging speaker about the whole corporate strategy and ESG space. Then we had episode 25 with Professor Alison Taylor. So we had back-to-back professor plus professor. But Alison Taylor, author of Higher Ground and professor at NYU Stern Business School, giving her interpretation in terms of where sustainability is going as a profession, how we need to keep the focus, and perhaps, as she was saying, narrower and deeper focus rather than trying to cover all issues and everything that's happening in the world, and trying to keep your sort of corporate radar so widely spread that you can't effectively deal with anything coherently. And then last week also, I mean, it's very interesting also, sort of maybe not on the front headlines at the moment, but the whole carbon markets and the way they're looking to rebound and to have this huge role in our decarbonization effort as we continue on that path. And we spoke last week to Gerhard Huber from eGreen, talking about the market, technology, transparency, and everything. So I invite you all to go and look, to listen back to the previous episodes, because I think there's some great context.
Thank you, James. Thanks for this. Yes, please.
Yeah, no, you were asking about Omnibus because obviously here in Europe, above all, it's been the talk of the town for. Well, it came out on the 26th of February, so a couple of weeks. People have been digesting and unpicking substantially the European Union announcing simplification and reduction in terms of sustainability reporting packages, due diligence, and environmental policies. And this has regarded the famous CSRD reporting. The CSDDD requirement on due diligence. It's also affected the way companies have to deal with the EU taxonomy rules and reporting against that, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, which looks to regulate and impose a carbon price on certain high emissions goods coming into the European Union. The whole effect of it has been really punishing for companies because it's all been introduced just after a lot of these things came into effect. So, I mean, the proposal, and I must insist that we're talking about a proposal, has been to reduce the number of companies within scope of the CSRD that, for years we've been talking about. They're finally, going to be this 50,000 companies obliged to start reporting on sustainability have been cut out because they've raised the threshold to 1,000 employees as a minimum. So after all of this, banging the drum and saying, boards and top managements must take this on and they must understand, and it's, coming from the top down, they've suddenly, pulled it back and created. And so where we are is it's been a proposal. It seems a very strong, robust, clear proposal, but it's subject now at the moment to discussion, and it has to be voted on. And so there's a whole another round of lobbying, and so companies who are in this actually don't have clarity. There's been a lot of discussion about the new rules. Some of them are TBD. So the whole thing of they also have been a lot of discussion about the complexity of the CSRD. Over 1,000 data points, and the EU said that will be reduced and simplified at some point in the future, but we don't know when and we don't know in what way. So there are companies who've just in these days have finally put together their first CSRD reports, and then they go back to their top management and they say, well, actually, we'll see next year. We're not sure, we don't know, and we can't actually plan. And it might be different, might be simpler. Some companies, and this is the last point, in the different jurisdictions in Europe, because some countries have adopted the CSRD into their national legislation, and some haven't. So I talked to one company and they say, hey, we're based in the Netherlands and they haven't adopted it. So, we're just sitting cool because, it's not applying to us. And there are other companies in Italy, for example, where it's adopted under the 1,000 people employee threshold who say, okay, so the EU is saying that I'm falling out of scope, but national law, I have an obligation to report. So it's like complete confusion on this, and obviously sending a very clear message to boardrooms across Europe of saying, hey guys, step down, don't worry, false alarm, go back to what you were doing before, because we're not going to oblige you to take this up, and a whole mantra that came with it, that this is going to drive sustainable business, it's going to drive investment flows, it's better for our economy. It's so they've walked back on all of that rhetoric as well. So I mean that was my first reaction.
The general sort of a perception is that it's the step back or a couple of steps back. But the question remains sort of why this is happening right now. Is it because we have the new administration in the US being heavily basically involved in dismantling all kinds of commitments in relation to this? Or is this related to, previously published Draghi report about EU competitiveness and the need for simplification of a lot of what has been, reported and complained about regulation in the European Union? I don't know, but the fact is that European industry has been doing a lot of things, positive things in this space. Transparency has been increasing. In many cases, some of these requirements are becoming voluntary, James. And the question is, what's voluntary? Will that be reported? And also, in sort of an entire idea was to support information, sort of a dissemination to investor community. And as an investor, I mean, am I looking at this from investment perspective? I think we need, of course, far more data, but we definitely don't need more voluntary data. So what's your take on it?
Yeah, what I feel is that there's this huge return to, well, it's kind of divides in two, right? So you have the larger companies who are still within scope. They're going to have a reduced complexity, which I think is going to be welcomed. It's unfortunate that it's happened, after the first round of reports. But I think in the longer term, if you think about the majority of the impact of the larger companies, it's over 1,000 employees. So that already captures thousands of major corporations, which will be the main focus of investors, because investors aren't necessarily, looking to most investment flows go to large caps and not to small caps or unlisted companies. So I guess it's a question of the depth of the economic system and the banking system that's going to be required, pushing towards medium and smaller sized companies. So I think at the moment, it's a lot of uncertainty. So you could defend it and say, well, for the larger companies, it's kind of going to continue. And I think that the global scenario, you're right, it has come back from the whole Draghi report and the whole competitiveness discussion. I think it's just been much intensified in the last few weeks when they came down to these decisions. But I think a really important thing for me is kind of the whole messaging as well, what it's saying to management and boardrooms generally about the importance of this and the system. So I don't know if that was your take as well.
I mean, look, it's a bit of a misguided thing that it's, if you're looking at the way how investors view ESG in different segments of the market. I mean, the juice, or what we call the ESG premium for the stock valuation, is actually more present on the small and medium cap side, because the reason is that this has not been included basically in evaluation models due to the fact that many of these companies are still sort of trying to do whatever they can to show or at least link ESG activities to the core business activities. In many of the large caps, the ESG has been priced in, which means that, continuous reporting without the clear value proposition, which we've been talking about, does not necessarily bring any value to them. So, from my angle, I think it's actually the medium cap, the small, medium-sized companies that are interesting because they represent across the board. If you look globally, up to 70% of all companies, and basically you can do it on every single market in the world. They are very, very even in Japan and Sweden and many other places. So it's interesting to see, how banks will react to that, and how will investments and also lending to small and medium-sized companies look like in a couple of years.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually, a very useful angle and a good reminder of the importance of the whole mid-sized companies and the importance of the banking industry. Actually, let's move on to another story news that's been around the last few weeks. Actually, the fate of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which has seen defections and by several major US banks. Coming back to what you're saying about the impact of the US election and the turning of the tide. Above all in the US in terms of ESG. And so now the news is that the Net Zero Banking Alliance is putting to a vote to its members, which include HSBC and Barclays, huge global institutions, about whether to maintain their commitment to aligning their assets with the Paris Agreement and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And, talking about whether they're able to soften the requirements within this alliance and maybe keep more banks on board in terms of the ambition and the level and the speed at which banks can actually drive the decarbonization process. So I don't know what you're making of where you think that's going to come out.
I mean, look, this has been going on for some time, starting with the Wall Street banks sort of walking out. Now, lately, some big Japanese banks also leaving. I mean, the entire idea with the Net Zero Alliance sort of was the joint effort, because in the banking industry, if the one hand does something different from the other hand, it's sort of a counterproductive, because in principle it means that many of the banks that would remain active in this alliance will be disadvantaged, because the banks that walked out will take bets and invest and lend to companies that will enable them to generate returns in a completely different way. So in my perception, when majority of the big capital banks have walked out, the importance and the efficiency of this alliance becomes very, very sort of watered down. So I'm not surprised with the fact that they're doing that. I think the sort of it's a bit of a a contradiction that many of these banks walking out of these alliances have, in many cases, insurance companies as clients. And these insurance companies as clients, they have a big trouble insuring and reinsuring a big parts of their businesses due to climate change, especially in the US, but also other parts of the world. So the question is, how short-sighted is this? And I think in many ways it is. It will create an environment where we were 10 years ago, where the banks will, be behind the curtains, continue to investing and lending to companies that are by far not even close to sort of tackle their emissions going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, which connects to another very important report that came out this week, looking at the number of companies that are actually contributing, major companies that are contributing to emissions worldwide. And so from the Carbon Majors database and the data that they have, found that just 36 companies, mostly fossil fuel and cement companies, are producing half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. That's on 2023 data. And actually what's interesting is of the 16 of the top, actually it comes back to your point about the role of banking and finance. 16 of these top 20 emitters are actually state-owned companies.
Yes.
And so it's the likes of, Saudi Aramco and Coal India and CNH Energy and the National Iranian Oil Company, huge sprawling empires that are owned purely by states where, commercial banks have a certain role, but again, it comes down to governments and state decisions, and a lot of effort made to try and push the major investor-owned emitters, sort of Exxons and Chevrons and Shells and BPs of the world. And it comes out that actually, compared to these sort of behemoths of fossil fuel industry, are actually small. They're big in sort of absolute terms, but, compared to these even larger ones. And so it's even difficult to say how we can force their hand, through market pressures again. That's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, that sort of points in a direction which many people don't know. This is sort of an unknown fact that basically only 10% of oil reserves in the world are owned by listed companies. And what I was, peculiarly interested in this report is that if you look at the major oil corporations around the world, which are listed, they stand for about 5% of the emissions. The rest is national oil corporations and big, as you said, enormous conglomerates around the world. And that's why, and if you go back to sort of a COP discussion, this is why the discussions on the UN level, on the country level emissions is extremely important, because this tells you basically that the countries like US or Saudi Arabia or India, if they don't commit and deliver on the targets, that basically enables these corporations, which are state-owned, to continue doing what they should not do. And this is it's sort of a not really common knowledge. Many people don't think about it. And I try to sort of see how this has been communicated. It doesn't seem to sort of take a spin. People don't necessarily think that 36 companies stand for 50% of the emissions in the world. And in the same time, we are sort of encouraging companies and people to take their responsibility. I mean, we know what needs to be done, but the question is, what are the forums? And the forum is, again, the COP is the only one we have where the national states need to sort of comply with the regulations, but not regulations, with the commitments they made. And looking at that, just to add the note on that, is the fact that many of these national goals that have been reported, I think I've seen that only UK is online to actually meet some of these targets around the world. So it's a very saddening information in relation to these national goals set by countries.
Yes, there's been very few countries that are actually keeping up, just the commitment of saying they're keeping up. So, as they go through the COP process, you have to say where you are on your progress, where you are, an update on your goals. And a lot of countries aren't even doing it. And that comes back to your point. I mean, I have to come back to you on this. What you were saying before about, it's, mid-sized companies are very important and there's so many of them, but what they'll come back to you and say, well, why should I be trying to be a climate leader and make progress and make commitment and actually have to invest in doing this when, the major damage is done by these huge, great big state-owned companies that aren't playing a role of watering down the climate. These, every time we see the COP every year and so many other fora globally, they say, well, everyone keeps on pushing back and say, well, we're not committed. So why should we either be forced or voluntarily take up the standard and sort of rage against the hurricane, which is blowing in the opposite direction?
Yeah. I mean, the answer to that question is that the bigger companies, the bigger you are as a company, the more resilient you are in terms of capital resources in relation to climate catastrophes, damages, supply chain disruption, and all of these other things that will hit you. You can relocate, you have a capital backing that you actually can support you. Small, medium-sized companies are nimble, but they don't have the same capital structure, and they are not as resilient in that way. So in many ways, from a risk perspective, small and medium-sized corporations, companies, listed, non-listed, private, need to, I think, in many ways view the integration of sustainability efforts in their business operations as the value creation, as much as they need to do that in order to protect themselves going forward and also cover the, a resilient part of the potential cost that this will create. I mean, look, this is a bit of an obnoxious situation we're in. CO2 emissions in the world are going up. If you look at the statistics of, these so-called whiplash climate events around the world, including the hits on different cities, I mean, we are in a very bad place right now in terms of the consequences. And the tragic part of it is that these sort of pushbacks that are coming right now are really coming out more based on, I would say, sort of a cultural war that has been sort of brought into the context of this than in relation to the real sort of risk we are facing. So as a part of my answer to you is that it is the small and medium cap companies in the world that can actually make money on this going forward and also save money on this.
Absolutely. Very good. And just to close on the COP question, and just to be even more happy and smiley and optimistic, we had words from Brazil's environment minister Marina Silva this week, talking about this triple whammy of negative forces, which are the confluence of the US withdrawal from climate action, new trade tariffs, and the resurgence of geopolitical conflicts. Going to have what she calls a triple negative effect on climate action, draining resources. And so he says, because the less action we see, the less money we see, resulting in less cooperation across countries. And obviously Brazil hosting COP30 at the end of this year in November in Belém. And so obviously she's already sounding the alarm, which is understandable, but obviously she's a very eloquent summary of just where we are, and seems to be tipping, as you say, it's a cultural thing. It seems to be tipping from one extreme really to the other, and overshooting enormously compared to what actually is the science and the reality and the impacts that we're seeing.
I mean, what surprised me even most is the fact that there are people like the energy secretary of the US that recently participated in one of these big energy events, basically saying that yes, climate change is happening, but we have to compromise, which means that we will have to adapt, and we will continue extracting fossil fuels around the world, especially in the US, and we don't see this being a problem. So it is a unreal sort of alternative reality to a certain extent that many of these people, I mean, ESG people and sustainability people live in a bubble, but there are also many other sort of groups of people that live in a bubble, especially, I guess, in this particular case, energy sector that in many ways, I mean, if you look at the numbers, Some projections are saying that the sort of the financial implications of stranded assets going forward is new research published in the UK will be trillions of dollars because the renewable energy is gradually really replacing fossil fuels around the world, which is a good thing. But it's not taking into account into our investments and banking industry, into our pensions. People don't really understand what kind of impact this will have.
Absolutely. We're having a bit of a longer episode here. We had so much, because we had our great 3 interviews, we haven't had a chance to kind of sit down, the two of us, and go through everything that's happening. So we've taken a bit of a longer session today just to sort of talk through some of these issues and catch up on some of the latest news that's kind of been around in the last week or two. Is there anything else that's caught your attention that you wanted to perhaps touch on in the last few minutes before we close?
I mean, there are different things, really different things that are happening, but unfortunately, many of them are really not so positive. Some of them that are positive is the research that has been published about how the CFOs view sustainability and sustainability value creation. And I know that, I mean, you and I discussed that before, but it's interesting to see that many of them actually see this as something that will contribute to strengthening of the businesses going forward. And this research is also clearly pointing out that, yes, there are some doubts, but in the same way saying that many of them will continue investing and supporting sustainability efforts because it does create value.
Yeah, that was really nice, actually. Came out that caught our attention this week. A survey of 500 different CFOs across different geographies from the US, the UK, I think in the Middle East and also in India. So a good representation of different geographies and different types of economies. Saying, CFOs are looking to prioritize initiatives with tangible near-term impacts on emission reduction. And, not kind of, again, a very business-driven discussion and not just like, oh, we'd like to, sort of strengthen our commitments. It was actually about putting money behind investments in the green economy. And 92% saying they will increase their current investments in sustainability, with more than half saying they will significantly increase their investments. So again, good that it's actually coming from the CFOs, this kind of a message that they kind of perhaps more granular level are sort of holding their course and seeing the benefits and seeing the returns on this, which is a key thing that we need to kind of tap into, I think, in this context and come back to people, rather than perhaps the great geopolitical and institutional frameworks that are being rolled back and undermined at the moment. Is actually looking to, as you said before, about the medium-sized companies, in terms of their resilience and in terms of their business benefits that they can get, above all, how they can turn it into a competitive lever for their own business and products, their services, how they connect with their clients, how they engage their employees. I think it's really important to look at the very specifics of the benefits that they can get from it. I think a lot of companies have tried to tap into this wider sort of ESG narrative in the last few years that kind of comes crashing down around their ears, because they've attached to sort of, again, even the SDGs is a very slippery terrain, because 2030 is rapidly coming up to us. And so companies that
And
have
that's
perhaps had
basically maybe one of the things that we should share with the audience of One Step Ahead Radio. Related to SDGs, US has decided to discard the SDGs and support to the SDGs. And it was communicated in a General Assembly by, I think, one of the representatives, one of the secretaries of the US government, basically saying that this is not serving American interest in the world. And, it's a very sort of a, I don't know how you would call it, complex or crazy sort of a decision, because about 66% of American companies are actually communicating their commitments to sustainable development goals in the reporting. Now, this will have implications on how European investors view them, because the European investors would need to have a look at SDG reporting to comply with some of the regulation they have in Europe. So I assume that many of these sort of rather radical sort of actions from the U.S. may in the long term be very counterproductive for U.S. Companies, including the tariffs that we have right now. But it's, of course, a completely another topic. Maybe before we close, James, there is a significant push in Europe, and discussion is very vivid on defense industry or weapons, whatever you call it, and investments in this industry from the ESG and sustainability perspective. There has been initiatives, I think it was in France and also in some other countries, to sort of rebrand defense or weapon investments as sustainability investments under the sort of umbrella of protecting democratic rights, which is a rather interesting thing. What do you think?
Yeah, this is going to be something that is really going to be a touch point in terms of 2025, because, the EU approach, the package that was unveiled, announced by Ursula von der Leyen to, sort of ramp up spending on defense, and the 800 billion euro figure. And as you said, coming from France in particular, I'd seen that again, saying, well, why do we have, why does the ESG prevent us from investing in arms and weapons? We have to redefine what ESG is, and it's seen as a barrier. And there are actually some quite strong comments, saying they're not, this is a hindrance again to what we're trying to achieve in the security and safety of our people. So again, another very contentious and something that's really going to get people's emotions riding high, because on both sides of the argument, that's a really, really strong question. I mean, I wonder where if you look at investment flows, whether ESG actually is an impediment to pushing money to arms companies and to the arms industry generally. It seems to be sort of another stick to beat the ESG investing with, while they're at it. So I'm sure it's going to go away soon.
I wrote some time ago a piece, I think it's scientific paper, and it's out there on this particular topic. And the thing is that if you really want to invest in arms industry, you can definitely do that through the investments in state bonds of the countries that are major producers of arms, which is a very easy way to do it, because arms is then controlled by states, and states are responsible for distribution, production, and use, which is completely fine. Investing in arms industry on a sort of a listed level, it's very sort of a small amount of companies you can invest in. Performance-wise, if you look at that, last 5 years hasn't been that good, even including the war in Ukraine. So there are much better sort of a sectors to invest in from sort of a performance perspective, if you're really looking for that. But if you want to support democracy and our ability to respond to dictatorship and autocracies, there are other ways, I think, you can do that. There is also unknown sort of information to many people, is that armed companies, weapon companies, defense companies, whatever you call them, to really not have capital issues. They have enough money because they have long-term contracts. And in many cases, it's not the money that is the problem. It is actually capacity and other infrastructure-related things. So with that, as you said, it's going to be interesting debate. We can come back to this next week and also probably take up this topic going forward. James, many thanks.
Definitely.
Very interesting discussion this week. Please, everybody listening to One Step Ahead Radio, share this with friends, family, people you think should listen, and come back next week again, because there are many interesting things coming up again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sasha. Well done for persevering with your voice. I'm sure it'll be better next week. So
I'm
thanks
sure.
again.
Thank you, James. All the best.
Take care.
Thanks.